You have reached the Dumb Christian. I am your host, Jonathan, and today we are jumping into John chapter 19, where Jesus is led away to be crucified, and why, if the Bible is true, and this really is God, would he allow himself to be treated this way? We're going to have to unpack and dig into some things, Old Testament, New Testament, what's going on here, and unfortunately we're going to be confronted with a face-to-face view of what it was that Jesus really endured when he went to the cross. The Bible's about to get real. We might get a little bit colorful, so buckle up and welcome to Dumb Christian. John chapter 19, read it for yourself as always, and a great movie to watch if you're interested, The Passion of the Christ, starring Jim Caviezel as Jesus. This is a real good visual representation of what we're going to talk about today in John chapter 19. Pilate wants nothing to do with Jesus, is trying to release him, can't find anything guilty, can't find him guilty of anything. The Jews are demanding, no. He claims to be the king of the Jews, which is weird because they are waiting for their Messiah to come and be a mighty warrior king over them. So when they say, he's not our king, we only have one king, Caesar. It's this really weird, how does that fit together? Anyway, Pilate says, well, I don't know what to tell you. I can't find anything wrong with him, and there's political layers going on here, so listen to John chapter 18 to find out what those are all about. But eventually he says, I wash my hands, you do with him what you want to do with him. Pilate even beat Jesus to a bloody pulp. Like when they say that, beaten to a pulp, you know what that is? Take orange pulp and just mash it on Jesus's face. That's what he looks like after Pilate beats Jesus in hopes that it would placate this crowd. No, crucify him. Pilate finally eventually says, okay, do it. So there are Roman soldiers who are then put in charge of escorting Jesus to where he will be crucified, and then to crucify him. Not just any old Joe can come off the street and crucify somebody. You can't just nail somebody to a cross. There's an art to it. And you have to have the Roman crucifixion certification plaque to be qualified to do this. So the Roman soldiers are in charge of this, and the crowds are just cheering and jeering, mocking, spitting Jesus, this beaten man, Jesus, who's unrecognizable, to just any old person. His mom knows who he is. His best friends know who he is. But he is then led through the streets and forced to carry his own cross through the streets of Jerusalem. Depending on what Jesus was actually carrying, some scholars say he would just carry the beam that went across, that his arms would be stretched out on, and that he just had to carry that. Some scholars say he carried the whole cross, the arm beam attached to the body beam. And so depending on which he did have to carry, the estimations are that he was carrying a giant wooden beam ranging from 100 pounds to 300 pounds, already having been beaten. He's got a ton of blood loss. He's exerting himself physically on top of this. There's stress, there's anxiety, there's fear, there's loneliness, there's pain, suffering. I mean, layers and layers and layers on top of what Jesus is experiencing. The Roman guards put like a purple robe on him to make fun of this idea that he's the king of the Jews. Then they twist together this. You ever see like really long, I think it's called a locust tree. And I literally just learned about this like 2 weeks ago. Shout out to Pat Ray if you're watching. And there's these large thorns, and what they would do, I don't know if it's the same tree over there, but here in the States, a locust tree will give you a good picture of what these thorns look like. Oh, here's like a kind of a representation of what it might have been. I'm showing, if you're just listening, I'm showing like a woven crown made of some vine thorns. And they put that on his head, again, to mock him as being king of the Jews. Then they put this large beam, whether it's the whole cross or not, hundreds of pounds, that he has to carry through the city while everyone is mocking and spitting on him. The same people that just days ago were worshiping him and celebrating his arrival into Jerusalem, proclaiming, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. This guy is our Messiah. He's our king. These same people within days have changed their tune to screw this guy, nail him to the cross, and kill his ass. And this is what Jesus is enduring as he walks through the streets of Jerusalem. He's already had so much blood loss. I don't even know how he's still conscious. But here's what's really crazy. If the Bible's true, and Jesus really is God, how is he just walking through the streets, making eye contact with these puny, petty little people who really, on the scale of the whole universe that God has created, are meaningless in a grand, relative scale? How is he looking at these people and in his heart saying, I love you. I love you. As they spit in his face, as they mock him, as they rail against him, and they tell dirty jokes about him, and he's, I love you, instead of, oh, I'm going to get you so good for this. You guys are going to get what's coming to you. And the reason why this would be like our natural, hang on, what's going on here? Why isn't he smiting the people? Because if he is God, the same God from the Old Testament, we've seen a number of instances where when God is treated with any kind of disrespect, he puts the kibosh on it real quick and he snuffs out that fire real fast. Oh, no. Oh, nay. You are not going to be getting away with disrespecting God. So what is happening here? If Jesus really is God, we can actually see throughout the Old Testament that when God is prophesying and telling his people how he's going to save people and redeem all of creation, he's going to send a Messiah who will be treated like this. The Jews have this Bible. This is their whole Bible. The Old Testament of the Christian Bible, but it's their whole Bible. And in it is God telling them, this is how my Messiah will be treated. Almost as if God knew it would happen, or even as if God intended for this to be the way that it happened. And some people look at this and they think, oh, God evolved in his personality. He changed the way that he thinks about sin and people and relationships and brokenness and etc. But what we see is that God is actually, from the Old Testament, he's already planning this, already setting things in motion to deal with the sin issue. The sin issue is God cannot be in the presence of sin. So when people sin, they sever that connection with God, and they are unable to be with God. The problem of sin is it causes an eternal separation between people and God. And from the beginning, God said, I will deal with it. I will fix it. I will solve the problem. And this is how. Because here we're seeing a very different side of God, which we'll get into here in a little bit. But Jesus is dragged through the streets, and he is led up to this place called Golgotha, just outside of the walls of Jerusalem. And this is called the place of the skull. Legend has it that this is where David, King David of the Old Testament, buried the head of Goliath after he came back from victory. If you remember that story, and if you don't, sorry, you're going to get a spoiler. At the end, David cuts off Goliath's head and brings it back to Jerusalem. Legend says this is where David buried the skull as kind of like a testimony for, hey, justice will be served, and your punishment for justice is death. The place of the skull is an open, avid reminder of you'll get what's coming to you. And Jesus is about to turn this place of punishment into a place of victory. Jesus is led out to Golgotha with two other criminals who have already been scheduled for crucifixion. It's been on the docket for weeks. The time has come. They're all three led out there to be crucified. While Jesus is laid on the cross, and the soldiers are strapping him to the cross so that he can't wiggle his way out of being nailed to it. They stretch out his arms. They put these leather straps on his wrists so that they can pull his arms out long enough. They pull so hard that they dislocate his shoulders out of their sockets so that they can stretch the hands into the holes where the railroad spikes that will pierce through his wrist and go into the wood to secure his body to the cross. There is a nerve right here inside your wrist that causes a type of pain that is not felt in any other situation unless it is pierced. They even had to invent a word to describe the pain that's felt on the cross. This is where the word excruciating comes from. They invented it to describe the type of pain you feel on the cross because it's unlike anything else. And while they're strapping him and nailing his arms and then his feet to the cross, either one nail through the top of each foot or one nail through both feet stacked on top of each other to secure him to the cross. While this is happening, these other group of guards are gambling for Jesus's clothes. And John tells us this is to fulfill prophecy. He actually tells us a few different times during this event, this happens to fulfill prophecy. This happens to fulfill prophecy. You can read it for yourself so you can see where he says that. I may not cover all of them. And that's going to be an interesting thing that I think is fair for some people to wrestle with. Is John just saying this so that it fulfills prophecy, or did it literally happen as a fulfillment of prophecy? That's a fair wrestling match that I can't tell you. You're going to have to wrestle with that on your own. But that's in there. He's lifted up. They raise up the cross because they can't just like position it standing and it's going to stand on its own. They actually have to drop it into a pre-dug hole that fits perfectly for the cross, and it sinks in about 6 feet, right? So he's lifted up, and then his whole body drops, and it shakes, and he drops against the nails, holding him to the cross, and he's hanging there. Blood loss, crown of thorns. His body has been ripped. He's probably naked. Remember, the soldiers gambled for his clothes. And as he's hanging there, he looks down and he sees his mother, Mary, some of Mary's friends, and his best friend, John, are all in a group nearby. And he looks down and he sees them. And he indicates to Mary and to John, you guys need to take care of each other like your family now. I can't imagine what that was like. And crucifixion is death basically by suffocation. It's not blood loss. There's not really any major veins or arteries that get punctured and you bleed out. Crucifixion is as you're hanging by your arms are lifted up so high that your diaphragm can't function properly and you can't breathe. So what you have to do is you're trying to pull yourself up by the nails in your wrists and push yourself up off of the nail in your feet to position yourself in such a way that you can take a breath. And as you push up, your back scrapes against the splintered cross. And then as you take a breath and you release and you lower yourself back down, again, it scrapes on the cross. But ultimately, death can take a long time, hours, even days, because you're waiting. They're basically just waiting for your body to give out. You keep pushing up and lowering, up and down until you are too weak to lift your body to take a breath, and then you suffocate. And Jesus has been enduring abuse, torture, beatings, mockery since like 3 a.m. It's probably about 3 p.m. somewhere. I'm guessing. I don't know for sure. He's tired. He never got to sleep. He's exhausted and he's thirsty. And he calls out and he says, I thirst. Someone runs and grabs a sponge full of sour vinegar and sticks it up so that he can take a drink. This is really disgusting. Some scholars say this was one of the sponges used to wipe asses after they took a shit. Yeah, that's insult on top of insult on top of injury, right? Here, just as Jesus is about to die, it says after he takes a drink, from this shit-covered sour vinegar sponge, he says, "It is finished," which is a weird thing to say when you're about to die. So why did he say that? When God said, "I'm going to deal with the sin issue," the consequence of sin is eternal separation from God. What that means ultimately is death. Okay? God said, "I'll solve the sin issue," but sin has to be dealt with. I'm not going to solve the sin issue by changing my mind about sin, by sweeping it under the rug, by ignoring it. I'm going to deal with the sin issue by paying for the consequence of sin, by paying the price of sin, separation from God, death, and ultimately I'm going to do that by paying the price myself. Jesus, God the Son, here is sent on a mission to solve the problem of sin by taking the consequence of sin, all sin, for every person, past, present, future, in all the history of the world, upon himself. Some extra bonus features that came with that mission was that while he was here on earth, he taught rightly about God. He corrected the views that people had about God. But ultimately, his mission was finished when he took upon himself the consequence of all sin, death. And he says, "It is finished." And not only did he solve the problem of sin with his death, but Jesus' death inaugurates a brand new way for people to interact with God. Again, if the Bible is true, what he's saying is, the old way that we used to interact with God was us trying to be good enough. This new way of us interacting with God just depends on whether or not we believe Jesus is good enough to pay the price. It's not a matter of whether we are able to fix the problem of sin, but whether or not we believe Jesus was able to fix the problem of sin, to give us that fixed right relationship with God. Once again, it is finished. And then he dies. Like I said, dying can take a long time on the cross. And it is Friday. We're getting close to Friday evening now. And Sabbath starts Friday at sunset and lasts until Saturday at sunset. Now, this Sabbath is an extra special Sabbath because it's a Sabbath during the celebration of Passover. Passover is a week-long celebration of God's salvation. Oh, I see what you did there, God. But you know, the specific Jewish festival is God saving Israelite from slavery in Egypt. Later in the New Testament, they change that. They kind of take this and say, look at how God saved us from slavery to sin, slavery to our inability to fix the problem of sin. This is how God takes this thing and just makes it immeasurably bigger and better. But it's a special Sabbath. It's a holiday Sabbath. And there's extra rules about how you interact with dead bodies and things that you can do. You can't work on the Sabbath. You can't do. There's a lot of extra stuff you can't do during Passover. And this is actually part of the plan and the plot of why they arrested Jesus when they did, because they knew if we can get the trial over with quickly, if we can get him on the cross quickly, and then people can't raise a stink about it, they can't bring any issue of it up to court because it's the Passover holiday and it's the Sabbath, they'll have to go back to the festival and forget about this Jesus fellow. So that's part of the whole plot here. But it's coming up on the start of Sabbath. We're getting later in the day Friday, and so they say we need to finish this up quickly. We need to wrap it up so that we don't contaminate ourselves, we don't defile ourselves, so that we can participate in the Passover celebration on Sabbath. So they tell the Roman soldiers, break the legs so that they can't push themselves up to breathe again. So the Roman guards go up, they break the legs of the other two guys who are being crucified. When they come up to Jesus, they see he's already dead, which is weird. Like I said, it can take a long time. The other two guys are very much alive still. So one of the soldiers comes up, grabs a spear, and stabs Jesus in the heart through the side. John says blood and water came out. Modern day doctors say when blood and water comes out, it's a sign that the person died of cardiac arrest. Think of the pressure and the exhaustion on his body. He's been beaten and he's been forced to carry the cross. Like he's been crucified, he's hanging, like all of these things, layers upon layers upon layers, and he dies ultimately of heart failure. His body just stops living. It gives out. And again, John says that's to fulfill prophecy, which is interesting. So, and then John says, the one who's bearing witness about this, I'm telling you this story because I was there. I saw it. I know it's true. I know Jesus died for sure. That's going to be important for later. So we won't give too much away there. They bring Jesus' body down. For the most part, the religious elite are like, all right, we don't give a shit about his body. We accomplished what we set out to, so do whatever you want with his body. A man named Joseph of Arimathea. This isn't in John. I'm pulling this from another gospel just because I think it's an important fact. A man named Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent wealthy man in the community who had just finished carving out a tomb nearby, near the place of the skull. And like we said, if you remember in John chapter 11, tombs for Lazarus's tomb are hewn or carved out of mountainsides, cliffsides, rock sides, in hills and mountains. And it's just a small room big enough to put a body. Joseph of Arimathea was a disciple. He followed Jesus and he said, I've got a brand new tomb. Let's use that. It's nearby. I want to honor Jesus in this way. John makes this very clear to indicate the tomb wasn't far off. It wasn't in some obscure hidden area. It was nearby, and everyone knew where the tomb was. That's going to be important for later. Then we meet a man who we've already seen once before in John chapter 3, a man named Nicodemus. Everybody say Nicodemus. Yeah. He shows up also as a secret follower, disciple of Jesus, with 75 pounds of spices and herbs to preserve and protect the body so that people could come and visit the body without being offended by the odor of rotting flesh. And then Jesus is placed in the tomb. A giant, large wheel boulder is rolled in front of the entrance so that no one can get to it over the holiday weekend. Now the sun is setting and the Sabbath of Passover is upon us, and everyone by law, every Jew is required by law to go back into their homes and eat the Passover celebration meal. And the Pharisees, the religious elite, are like, hell yeah, we did it. Screw that guy, Jesus. Look at how God saved us from this Bogand who went around trying to undermine our faith, belittle our belief in God, and ruin the foundations of our ancient religion. While his disciples are required by law to go back to their families, to their homes, and eat the exact same Passover meal that Jesus ate with them the night before when he said, whenever you eat the Passover bread, remember my body. Whenever you drink the Passover wine, remember my blood poured out for a new covenant. Again, we don't get the Lord's Supper taught us through the Gospel of John. I'm pulling that from other Gospels. But his disciples are eating that exact same meal that they had the night before. And I can't imagine that they're anything but hopeless. And I'm not hungry. I can't eat. I can't celebrate. And that's a really weird thing too, because in the Jewish culture, if you weren't celebrating God's salvation during Passover, you could get kicked out of the community. It's really frowned upon to not party like it's year 99 for Passover. And here are his disciples who can't see how anything good can possibly come out of this situation while they're eating the meal to remember God's salvation. All it's doing is reminding them of what their friend, their leader, their Messiah has just endured. His body was broken and his blood was poured out for us. And every time I eat this meal, it just wrecks me. Anybody know what that's like? Where you're stuck in this place of perpetual hopelessness and despair, and I can't see how anything good can possibly come out of the situation. And that's the tension that they found themselves in that night. The tension of the fact that later they'd be able to look back and say, oh, the truth is God had to deal with the sin problem. He couldn't just forget about it. He had to deal with it. And grace is that Jesus, God the Son, was the solution. And on that note, I'd like to introduce you to a new podcast that a friend from my home church and I have been developing. We're calling it the Tag Cast, where we're going to tag team. We're going to go back and forth as we explore truth and grace. So I'm going to end today's episode with giving you guys a little sample of that. I love you guys. I'll catch you later.
It's almost like truth without grace is just condemnation.
And grace without truth is just permission.
And to see things through God's lens, we need both truth and grace.
Like their tag team partners. We should do a podcast where we tag team like the Bible and issues going on in the world through the lens of truth and grace.
Well, that's an idea.
You got any snacks? I am hungry. Oh, and we could call it the Tag Cast. All right, Tagcast is coming down the line. Be on the lookout for that. I'll send you guys links once it's live and ready to go. But yeah, this was the crucifixion, the murder of Jesus Christ, God the Son. Hold on to hope, guys. There's something better around the corner. Be sure to check us out on YouTube, Dumb Christian Podcast. We have exclusive content coming up on there. Hit subscribe, ring the bell so you know when new content's dropping. And I'll catch you guys later. Love you guys.